Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our session today, run by the Lowitja First Nations Health and Wellbeing Journal. Our session today is the Consider Statement, How to Strengthen Research Involving Indigenous Peoples, by Suetonia Green and Tania Huria. I would like to begin by acknowledging the country on which we're all dialing in from today. I know we're all dialing in from different places, so feel free to type where you're dialing in from in the chat. I'm dialing from Wadawurrung country, so I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people who are joining us at this webinar today. So I would like to pass the mic to Tania to introduce herself and begin the webinar. So I hope you enjoy.
Kia ora, thanks Kristy. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. I too would like to acknowledge the Indigenous lands that we are meeting on today. Where I am in Aotearoa, it is the Indigenous owners of this land in Ōtautahi, Christchurch, Ngāi Tua Huriri, which I whakapapa to. So, and we just recently, as in yesterday, held a massive hui looking at Indigenous economies at Mai Marae, which is about 40 minutes out of Christchurch. What we're going to do today, unfortunately Suetonia couldn't join us today because she started her new role as the Dean of the Dunedin School of Medicine. So we've actually pre-recorded our session today, and then at the end of the session there'll be time to answer some questions. So please enjoy the video. And I'll do it. There's a brief mihi from me at the beginning just to explain who I am again. And yeah, I'll look forward to the questions at the end of the video. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, ko Waio, ko Mauka Tiriti Mauka, ko Rakahuri Te Awa, ko Ngāi Tahuroa, ko Ngāti Mutunga ki Wharikauri o ku iwi, ko Ngāi Tua Huriri Te Hapu, ko Tania Huria taku ingoa.
Kia ora koutou, ko Waio, ko Suetonia Green taku ingoa.
Kia ora Sway.
Kia ora. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Really good.
Excellent.
So what are we up to today?
Well, we've been kindly asked, and we're very privileged to be here today to just share a little bit of information, a bit of a background story, some whakapapa about the Consider Statement, so the consolidated criteria for research reporting with Indigenous peoples.
Yeah. And the really important thing about the Consider Statement is it's really trying to support researchers to strengthen their research. So it's a really strength-based kind of framework for us. So that's what we're all about today, is trying to just work through how this statement can support your research involving Indigenous peoples. So we might want to kind of wind the clock back and talk about, like, how did we even come up with this plan and where did it come from?
Right, yeah, well, it's quite a funny story. Well, it's funny now, post PhD, but at the time it wasn't quite so funny. So Suetonia had the pleasure of being one of my PhD supervisors, and for my PhD I was investigating inequities in chronic kidney disease, and obviously one of those processes was around doing a systematic literature review. Now, over the course of the systematic literature review, I started to get a little bit grumpy, didn't I?
You did.
Yeah, I got a little bit grumpy because I was reading this research and I really couldn't, there was some that was really great, but there were others that I couldn't really see where the consenting process had happened, how the Indigenous group that was involved in the research had been in partnership, how they'd prioritised the research. Remember, I was really grumpy.
Yes.
And there was one particular study, that original study, that had multiple studies afterwards using the same set of genetic samples, and nowhere, and this was a huge population study that, you know, in any other systematic literature review, would have been there. And I became really, really grumpy because there was so much data. There was so much data using these same samples.
And the samples had been just used over and over and over again with, I don't remember how many publications there were arising from that one paper, but there was nothing in the paper that helped us understand what the consenting process was for those participants. Like, did they know that their samples were being used over and over? Did they know what their samples were being how they were being spoken about? Did they know what was being published? And we just couldn't figure it out, could we?
And that, did they know that, did they were they asked for consent for future use?
Yeah.
Because it was essentially it was a sample bank.
Yeah.
They turned into a sample bank.
They did.
And it was really concerning to me as an Indigenous PhD student to cite research that I wasn't sure was actually tika or safe.
Yeah, that's right. And so we kind of thought, well, what can we do about this? And so we kind of started to hunt around the literature and realised that there were just heaps of guidelines, best practice about what we can do as researchers to kind of make sure that we stay safe and enable our research to be safe when we're involving and partnering with Indigenous peoples and samples and data and information. But we realised that all of that information was kind of like scattered on the interwebs, wasn't it? It was just like everywhere. And we thought, this is amazing. There's so much best practice out there, but how do we actually use it as researchers?
And remember we had that conversation that, researchers have to go through an ethics process, and in that ethics process they have to indicate, in most of the regions that we were sort of researching with regards to chronic kidney disease and Indigenous peoples, they have to indicate, how they will work ethically with Indigenous peoples in those Indigenous nations. But then we realised that there was no closing of that loop. So from that particular study where I got really, really hoha and grumpy, we realised that people weren't reporting on those ethical practices.
So they might have been doing them, but we just couldn't be sure. So when we were reading research, just like we do with all sorts of research, we just couldn't pull out from the papers what had actually been done. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be great to kind of set up a framework or a checklist, bringing together all of the international best practice and all the international guidelines into kind of one single framework, so that we as researchers could just make sure that we were doing everything according to best practice. And then we found an amazing team, didn't we?
You did, yeah, really amazing.
A few rock stars, actually, to be fair.
And that was actually really important that we did, that our team reflected, I guess, the enormity of what we were trying to do. And so we were really clear that we needed to have representation from Australia, so our closest cousins, and then we were also really clear that we actually needed someone very senior in this space to help guide us in what we're doing, and making sure that, almost in that tuakana taina relationship, just to check in and make sure that we had got the knowledges correct.
Yes.
And so we were really fortunate to put that team together.
Yeah, and they kind of kept us on the straight and narrow, and it was really iterative, wasn't it? Like, we checked in with each other, we were constantly reviewing our perspectives and how we were describing the literature and how we were reporting the best practice. And so the team was just really essential to this, kind of as it is in the checklist. Like, the research team is really, really important. So probably what we could do is talk about what the consider checklist actually is. Should we do that?
Yep.
Yeah. So the checklist, the consider checklist is a series of multiple domains, and in each of those domains is a checklist item. And so what it helps us do as researchers is, when we're right at the beginning of our research, like when we're even just having the idea, how are we going to set up our research in a way that is true partnership and ensuring that it's a strengths-based approach with Indigenous peoples. So the idea of the checklist, and it's published globally, it's freely accessible, so anyone can use it. And basically it sets out a series of steps that we all should think about when we're doing our research involving Indigenous peoples, right from who are we working with, what is the governance structure around how we're working with Indigenous organisations, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous structures. So what is that governance right through to the dissemination of like, how are we ensuring that the work that we're doing is actually going to strengthen outcomes, whether it be health outcomes or research outcomes or knowledge outcomes. So we're trying to make it like super easy as a checklist, and the whole idea is that we don't have to do every single one perfectly, because we're all on a research journey and we're all learning, and we're all within organisations that are actually learning how to do this. So it's best practice, and what the whole point of the checklist is to help us figure out what we need to be doing in our own space and how do we do it, and then we can work towards it.
Yeah. And it also actually, I think because it is such an iterative process, is that actually during that partnership phase, things may change.
Yeah.
And so the priority for your research as a researcher, or for the research group, or for the institution, may not be the same as for the Indigenous peoples that you're working with. And actually, the consider statement actually says, stop, let's check, is this really what people want to investigate? Is there some scope in that? Where are the benefits for that particular group, and how are you going to build that into your research?
Exactly. And I think the most important thing for our point of view is that this is about strengthening practice. This is about all of us improving our practice and being more aware, so that when we're more aware of the kinds of things that we need to be doing as researchers and as research teams, then we can go away and think about that, find the resources, enable our team, get professional development, understand what our institution is actually doing, so that over time, you know, even over the next 5, 10, 15 years, hopefully in 15 years we can see our research teams, how they've evolved, how we've all evolved over time, and that this is just a constant learning process, isn't it?
Because a really great example of that at Otago is our MOU with Ngāi Tahu, who are the mana whenua, or people of the land of Te Waipainamu, or most of Te Waipainamu, particularly in our southern campi of the Christchurch and Dunedin. But then also how that relationship informs our strategic framework. And actually within the strategic framework, there are clear instructions of what we must achieve as an institution. And in doing that, it actually places the onus on the institution, as opposed to putting more burden on Indigenous peoples and communities, which I think is really important.
So that's really the first item, or the first domain on the checklist, isn't it, around governance, and that we as researchers can look to our institutions and who we work within to understand what our institutions are actually doing around partnership with Indigenous peoples. And that we've now got a Māori strategic framework within our university that helps us demonstrate our aspirations towards strengthening research as an institution and being socially accountable as an institution. And so as research teams, it's our responsibility to know that that document actually exists and what it actually says, and then what our institution is actually doing about it, so that we maintain accountability through our leadership, and then we're partnering across with leadership with Indigenous peoples and organisations, so that we're not putting heavy pressure on individuals, we're not putting heavy pressure on individual Indigenous researchers to have that kind of cultural load. What we're doing is we're pushing it up to our leadership, and it's their responsibility, and we can keep them accountable as well. And it enables our research to actually reflect the priorities of our organisation as it relates to Indigenous organisations. So I guess that's the first domain, isn't it, the governance, and how do we increase Indigenous research practice and capacities through governance and being kind of responsible as a collective. And the next domain in the consider statement is prioritisation. And what that's all about is who decides what research is actually going to be done, and who decides what research is really important, and who are the priorities, what are the priorities for research? And so, you know, we'll all be familiar with priority frameworks in other aspects of our research, you know, prioritization exercises where people come together and decide this is actually the most important thing. And one of the common examples of that is patient priorities. So what is actually most important to patients who have a particular condition or experience a particular condition? What's actually most important to them, and how does our research align with that? So the consider statement's really talking about actually who prioritizes how and what research we do, and what are the most important things for Indigenous peoples about the kinds of research investment we need to do and where those projects lie. And so we've got our own local example, Ngā Hua Akoranga. So, and in COVID, what happened was our local team, our Māori and Indigenous Health Innovation team, led our local health services to provide mobile vaccination clinics for Māori by Māori, and that was a huge priority for the community. And what's happened as a result of that is that the team are now actually doing research to understand, do some process evaluation of those clinics and what they delivered and what actually worked and what didn't work.
So the next domain on the checklist, so we've gone governance, prioritisation is relationships.
Yeah.
And relationships is key for any community that is based on a collective understanding. And so when we were thinking about developing the consider statement, and we put all of the different checklists together and all of the best practice guidelines around research with Indigenous peoples together, relationships was the strongest consensus across the globe, basically. And that relationship needs to have some reciprocity, and it needs to happen right from the genesis of the idea. And I don't think I need to explain to too many people about practices of, oh, shivers, we need to get the Indigenous tick, we better go and ask so-and-so, but we are actually almost finished our research.
Yeah.
That's not cool. So not cool at all. And actually, by using the consider statement, we can monitor that now, and we can monitor that actually relationships were developed across the time of the research and across the process, which is really important.
And we know it's really important. There was a really lovely study and analysis done in 2014 by McLaughlin et al. And that was based in the Kimberley Aboriginal Health Planning Forum Research Subcommittee. And what they did was they did a very significant piece of work where they reviewed a lot of the research that was being done in the remote Kimberley through their ethics processes and their research processes. And they found some really important findings. They found that consultation, as you said, it didn't happen when people were having the idea. It happened really, really late. And so that meant that researchers couldn't actually align what they were doing with the expectations of the community. They weren't able to plan ahead so that the community could plan ahead and be available. They found that the research placed a really huge burden on communities because it wasn't designed ahead of time, and those relationships weren't already in place. Everyone was kind of trying to play catch up as the research kind of trundled along. And it was really hard for people to make time, to set it up, to get it right. And communities were very committed to the research because it was really important, but they did that at the expense of their own resources and their own time and their own relationships. And the other really important thing about the research was that they found that the research got in the way of actually health service delivery. So often the team on the ground and the organisations in the Indigenous communities would actually take time away from their own health service delivery or providing health services in order to commit to the research. And so because the relationships hadn't been set up and all that timetabling hadn't been done, actually the research was having a negative impact on health service delivery, which I'm sure is exactly the opposite of what the researchers were trying to achieve. But because those relationships weren't already set up, it just made it really challenging for everyone. And I think we could say that the research actually caused harm, not good. And through no intent, it was just that there was no framework around how people set up their research and developed interactions and governance and relationships with the communities. But I think you've got a different, probably more strength-based example.
Well, I think that, like I said previously, relationships are key. And so I also work for an NGO here in Aotearoa, and for those of you that also work for NGOs, you know it's pretty brutal out there sometimes, and sometimes actually, you know, we can forget that because we're driven by contracts, and so part of the consider statement and and how it can be used in that NGO space is just working as that. Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right thing and building these relationships? So we have international programs to where I'm working, and it's very clear that we had no framework before we went into significant areas in the Pacific to talk about sexual well-being, and we needed to build those relationships. And so now we use the consider statement to allow us to monitor our impact and what we're doing with those relationships. So we now have that governance with the government organisations, but then also with local providers on the ground. And we've developed relationships with local research groups. So it's not our group going in to do the research. We've employed local research groups to support those that are doing the work on the ground, as opposed to the people doing the work on the ground having to do the research as well.
Yeah, and what that also does is kind of like, I've heard it talked about helicopter research, where you kind of land, do the research, and then get in the helicopter and go again. And then there's this huge gap on the ground. No one has had their own capacity or their own resources built up by that research. And it's kind of like there's this gap when you leave, rather than this ongoing legacy of strength and support. Yeah. The next considered domain that we have from best practice is around methodologies, and how do we think about the way that we do the research and the way that we consider, no pun intended, how we work with a Indigenous worldview. And the reason that that's really important is because we need to reflect on what the impacts of colonisation are on the communities that we're partnering with in our research, and how that might impact the capacity of everyone in the research to contribute, and what the potential for the negative impact of research might be. So colonisation, as we know, is the political process where governments, often European governments, have arrived in countries and through political processes have extracted the resources of the Indigenous peoples who are living in those places, taken land, and it's resulted in, you know, very substantial intergenerational wealth loss and all of the consequences of that, including increased exposures to risk factors for long-term conditions, including diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And we know that colonisation is an ongoing process, that a lot of our governments are using the tools of colonisation in an ongoing
research
way.
can be one.
Yeah, and exactly, and research can be its own kind of highly colonised process, where the process extracts resources from Indigenous communities without recognising the impact of that. And so we as researchers can be aware of the outcomes of colonisation and what impacts those have on Indigenous communities, and how we're really mindful of that, so that we can plan our resources and we can make sure that we're providing resources to the communities that we're partnering with and working with, as a recognition that we're righting the wrongs at some level in the process of actually doing our research. And what that looks like is actually funding our Indigenous communities that we're partnering with, thinking about when we're writing grants and applying for resources, partnering with communities to understand what that research actually needs on the ground so that that funding can actually be provided and enabled. And that might be supporting a PhD student, or it might be supporting a senior Indigenous researcher to enable us to complete those partnerships safely and effectively. But we just really need to be mindful of whose resources we're using and how are we contributing to that, and what are we doing to enable those resources to be provided in the course of the research, so that the research isn't yet another kind of extractive process. And then also thinking about the Indigenous worldview. And I wonder if you've got some thoughts about that on terms of being inclusive of an Indigenous worldview in the research that we do.
I think we're currently at a space and place and time where we have the most amazing Indigenous-led mātauranga knowledges. It's always been there, but I think that we have an opportunity to ensure that those knowledges are pushed to the forefront of any research that's involving Indigenous peoples. Things like decolonising methodologies by Linda Smith, the Indigenous quantitative standards by Maggie Walters. You know, we have a lot of very theory-based but excellent frameworks to hang our methodologies on now, and actually we can align all of that. You know, it's no longer acceptable to say that we can't do Indigenous methodologies on quantitative data, because that's just not the case. So actually we have all of these beautiful methodologies and frameworks that we need to include, cite, utilise, talk about and report on. That's what we've done.
Yeah. And it's all evidence-based, it's very clear, it takes a strength-based approach so that we're really mindful we're not seeing and reporting and perpetuating deficit, that it's all a strength-based approach. So should we go to the next domain, which is participation? And I think this kind of follows on really nicely from when you got really grumpy at the beginning and how consent can actually, how do we ensure that participation is a partnership in research, and how do we enable consent and what that looks like in the process? So what would have good consenting or a strengths-based consenting process look like for that team in North America who had that sample bank?
Information, full informed consent and reporting on what that information looked like. So being informed that actually your sample, your tissue sample, your DNA sample, whatever the sample is that's been taken, is likely to be used for other research processes that are investigating the same condition. You know, full informed consent, which I think has been missing. So with participation, consent is key. And that needs to come right at the beginning again. And so, you know, those processes need to be written into the, you know, the project pilot, the pre-study, the, you know, everything that the thought process goes through, that needs to be at forefront and centre. Because if that's not there, then we're just doing exactly the same as what that research did back in the 70s.
That's right, and that consent, you know, we've deliberately put participation kind of at this point in the checklist because it comes after all of the other domains, doesn't it? It's like we're making sure that our institutional connections and leadership are appropriate. We're making sure that the resources are there, that we're making sure that the relationships are already developed, because we can't kind of like bang on consent at the end without all of those other components.
And being transparent. And actually, because the damage that has been done historically is when research hasn't been transparent. And that is what needs to happen. And unfortunately, we've developed this practice of being a bit closed closed off, and we actually need to stop doing that. And so the consider statement allows us to report, or actually demands that we report on how we've gone through those processes.
And the other idea or the other concept that's evidence-based is the concept of collective consent, that while individuals can provide consent, that often this needs to be a collective, and it may be that a family or a whānau want to be involved in that discussion. Maybe it's a larger group of people, that consent is not just one person putting their hand up and saying and trying to understand the information or trying to learn about what it involves for them, but they will be accountable and responsible and connected to a wider group of people, and so that consent processes need to be aware of who actually needs to be in the room.
Yeah, and I think that leads into, you know, with participation, we need to have a clear sort of direction around who holds the power, and actually the power lies with the communities.
Yeah.
And so if they're not happy and they want to pull their participation, then unfortunately that's what has to happen.
Exactly right.
And if this process is being followed, then actually there will be conversations about how things can be adapted to make it better. But ultimately the power lies with the communities and not with the researcher or the research institution.
That's right.
Because that has been done, and it's been done really badly.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm just thinking about the next domain. We're getting towards the end of the checklist, but the next domain is capacity building. And I think we're getting some themes here around how the consider statement and thinking about these domains can kind of strengthen our own research. And so capacity building is about how we do our research in ways that strengthen Indigenous knowledges, strengthen Indigenous community capacity, enable the knowledges that come out of the research actually to be used and support Indigenous resourcing and strengths and intellectual property and those sorts of things. So this domain is really enabling our research teams to figure out what is it that they're going to do to enable the capacity building as part of their research. And that again kind of can happen over a really, really long period of time.
Yeah, and I think it's really important with capacity to also acknowledge loading. And so when we're talking about capacity building within the consider statement, we're also asking researchers to think about their own professional development and think about what's on offer in their own organisations. I think about what's been started here at University of Otago, Christchurch, with the modules that we're going through. Did you want to talk a little bit about modules?
I think we've got a Māori Health Advancement Research Committee, which is a subcommittee of our main research committee here on our campus. And that subcommittee, our Māori Health Advancement Research Committee, has set up a continuing professional development program for all researchers on our campus, including our research students. And we've got really clear modules and competencies that we're enabling our researchers to achieve. And the earliest level of their learning is online modules where they can learn about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our treaty. They can learn about the consider statement. So they've got modules where they can gain their own competencies, they can work in their own time to do that. And then the next level up is workshops where they can bring their own research projects, they can use the competencies that they've got from the first online modules and kind of develop more competencies actually in the actual research that they're doing. And then the final level is where we get teams working across with each other to develop these ideas and actually put the consider statement and all of the other competencies actually into practice. And for capacity, that looks like funding our Māori senior research fellows, funding our PhD students, funding projects that are led by our Indigenous researchers, but also recognising that when we are placing cultural load on our Indigenous colleagues, that we're really explicit about what we're asking, and that no is an okay answer, and that we're also funding that cultural knowledge as well, so that we're not going in kind of taking stuff, but we're actually going, this is the knowledge that we would love to partner with you on. We don't know if you've got capacity to do that. If you do, here is the funding for that, and that is what that might look like for our partnership.
Yeah, and also using those tools within that academic process, right? Like authorship and those sorts of things to build up that capacity and that research profile for PhD students, for senior research fellows that are Indigenous is really important.
And building up their track records so that, because it's all super important for funding.
Yeah.
And if we don't have that track record, then we just don't, we're not competitive in the funding environment. So it's just really important that, like, every time we're building a research project, that's part of what we're doing. Yeah. Analysis. This is really key, isn't it?
Yeah. I think analysis and interpretation is vital. So you've laid the foundation with the other domains, and with the analysis and interpretation, you're really putting the cream on the cake with this one. So you're thinking about, what you've found, what your research is finding, how you're going to incorporate Indigenous values into that research. How is it strength-based? How is what the analysis tools that you're using, how does it tell the narrative that is strength-based? So even if your findings may elicit inequities, what are you going to do to ensure that actually there is a focus not on the deficit, but on the strength of what you've found? So, and that could be that you've identified privilege.
I was just thinking that, because remember that paper that we wrote together around the inequities in practices and delivery of kidney replacement therapy for people with advanced chronic kidney disease. So we're talking about dialysis and transplantation. And we found that non-Indigenous people have privilege in the system, and that's how we described it in the paper. It was a bit of a, we had to really think very consciously about how we presented those data, and that we were identifying where the system worked and for whom, and that enabled us to understand how we needed to have a systems-based approach to quality improvement within health service delivery. And so we weren't talking about the deficit or the fact that our Māori patients and whānau family didn't access things. We were talking about when the system privileged our non-Indigenous patients and families, and what that meant for quality improvement. And that was a really deliberate use of language and really deliberate positioning to think about how we talk about inequity and what it actually means.
And that is when you see Indigenous scholarship capacity building, because that thought process in our analysis came straight from
Maggie
Walter's presentation at the Lewitcha conference in Melbourne.
Exactly.
I can't remember the year, but that is what we're talking about when we're saying reporting and building and citing Indigenous knowledges is crucial in developing best practice with Indigenous peoples.
And we drew on her best practice and her scholarship to help us frame what we were going to do. And
we were very excited.
We were actually. And so the last domain is dissemination. Like, what does our research actually achieve out in the world when we're partnering with Indigenous peoples? And I think this kind of draws on everything we've kind of talked about already. Like, how does this research pay forward? What does it do to enable increased capacities, knowledges, understandings, principles, values? How does the research then enable us to reinvest in the peoples that we've been partnering with, and enabling aspirations, basically, doesn't it? Knowledge-based, expert-based aspirations.
And I think we have some wonderful examples of this. Like Dr. Maira Patu's example with the Indigenous mobile vaccine program and the research that's been wrapped around that. We've recently had the launch with Mauterangi Māori Clark, who is one of our research fellows here at University of Otago, Christchurch, who's recently been on a team that's launched an Indigenous glossary of terms for eating disorders. And there has been research that looking at Indigenous knowledges around bipolar, and internationally there's been some wonderful work coming out of Canada, Hawaii, Australia, talking about Indigenous solutions. And I think that is the key when we're thinking about dissemination, because it doesn't just stop with a publication. And unfortunately that's historically where a lot of research has stopped. We need to actually think about the transformative practice. So from the bench to the bedside, what does it look like? Or from the bench to the community, what does it look like?
And how do we ensure that that knowledge is given, enables the communities to build their own policies, to build their own practices, to achieve their own next step in investment? What does that research actually enable people to do in the next iteration of the work? How does it change policy? How do we work with the institution that we've partnered with to enable their institutional aspirations and goals to actually be realised through the research? So it's kind of like the research coming full cycle, isn't it?
So we've recently done some work with an Indigenous research group investigating wahine thoughts around contraception and experiences around contraception, and the work is amazing, the research is amazing, the narrative is amazing, but as an organisation it shouldn't sit with us. And so what we've done is we've put in a loop, a feedback loop and an accountability loop, where we've said we're going to come back to you, to the research group, and show what we've done as an outcome of these wahine's narratives, and show how we've changed structures and show how we've changed our advocacy, and they're going to disseminate it back to the participants.
And it comes back to institutional accountability as well. I mean, I'm really looking forward to it. Our ethics committees are doing an amazing job in this space, but that continued kind of ensuring that we as researchers are held accountable for that dissemination loop, that we're actually disseminating to the people who we're hoping to increase the capacity with and partner with, and how that's done at an institutional level. So, you know, the next few years I'm hoping will be really exciting as kind of this knowledge that everyone is building kind of gets more embedded in what we do, and our accountability mechanisms as well.
And the consider statement has been used, it's been used in a variety of ways.
I know,
it's been used. It's
gone a little bit viral.
Yeah, it's gone a little bit viral. And it's been used as, you know, a completeness of reporting tool. It's been used as a way to sort of review the reporting of research done within different specialties. Like it's been used by the Australian New Zealand Journal of Public Health as a checklist to ensure that the research that they're publishing fits that best practice criteria. It's pretty cool.
It is. So I think that's all we've got today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, kia ora.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tania, and please pass on our thanks to Suetonia. That was a wonderful presentation. It was so wonderful to hear the origin story of how the consider statement was developed, and the in-depth explanation of all the domains, and how we as researchers can not only ensure that the research is safe for our team, but is safe for mob and community that are involved in our research. So we really appreciate that you guys were able to take the time to record that for us. We'll now open up the floor to questions. There is a question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So anyone who would like to ask questions, please submit questions in the question and answer function, and I will ask Tania those questions for you. Your recording was so thorough, I think we might not have any questions.
I'm off the hook. I guess one of the key things here, and the reason that we did want to do the pre-recording when we knew that Suetonia wasn't going to be able to attend, is that her role as a non-Indigenous supervisor, but also as a non-Indigenous researcher, was really was a really important part of that partnership kōrero, because it's important that we find our allies, but it's also important that we educate our allies as well. And so it was really crucial to have that sort of insight from Suetonia, not only during the creation of the consider statement, but also, you know, for ongoing research, and the influence that she's had on others in her area of expertise has been really amazing.
Yeah, we've actually got some questions. So the first one is, do you have any suggestions around navigating collective consent?
Yeah, that's it comes down to relationships, doesn't it? And I guess it's really crucial that that when you're working with a community where collective consent is crucial, that you acknowledge that you may not get it right, and so the power though stays with that collective. And so if you haven't got it right, they can tell you that you haven't got it right and that you need to come back and do the XYZ. And so you give yourself space and place to do that. You need to talk to the key people in that area and ask what is the best way to approach that. So for example, for an Aotearoa context, you know, if I was going to go and do some thinking about doing some research within a Māori women's space, I would automatically think of going to the Māori Women's Welfare League, which is a national organisation that has different branches all over Aotearoa, and get direction from them about where I should go, because I can't say that my research is going to support all Māori women in Aotearoa, but what I can say is that we have worked in partnership with a large organisation that supports the health and well-being of Māori women and their whānau. So, you know, it's important to align yourself with and really invest time in those relationships, and write it in your study protocol, actually, because that's often where you know, Indigenous research practices gets criticised as, oh, it took so long. It's like, well, it took so long because we were building really effective partnerships that's going to last a research lifetime. So it needs to be placed in your protocol and valued in your protocol.
Thank you. We've got another question. I'm just wondering if the consider statement has been retranslated to other areas of research.
It's really interesting. It's sort of got its own legs, and people are picking it up and interpreting it as they would like to. I guess the key kaupapa with the consider statement is that we have all the tools and technology around best practice. You know, individual nations have actually given us these tools, and these tools have been around for a really, really long time. But what hasn't happened is being able to monitor whether what people said they were going to do when they signed their ethics is what they actually did. And so if we take it right back to that original kaupapa, it's about monitoring, and it's about accountability, and it's about transparency. And so if that's something that needs to be in place in other areas and spaces, then go for it.
We've got someone commented, amazing discussion. How would you recommend discussing these topics with supervisors or senior academics who might need some guidance?
Guess what? It's just been cited in the Lancet. You can't argue with the Lancet. And so so the the Lancet, the new guidance to authors, they put out a commentary in June, and I can send you the link actually. And in there, they have acknowledged that medical journals such as the Lancet have played a really huge role in the power imbalance about what knowledges are prioritised in our spaces and places. And so they have reviewed their guidelines to authors, particularly for reporting, research reporting racial or ethnic differences in health research, and they have stated that people need to now, when they're going to be sending research to the Lancet, that they need to actually follow models such as the Consider statement in order to get published.
Yes, and I think that that's something that's happening a little bit more widely, because even for the First Nations health and wellbeing, we now require people to report against the Consider statement upon submission. So it's great that it's, you know, getting out there and being used more widely amongst journals and becoming a prerequisite for submission.
Yeah, and you know, I know I know there is different. I mean, I had amazing supervisors, but as an Indigenous PhD student, actually, it's about your safety too. And if you are having those conversations and you are being challenged about, you know, your own safety levers, then actually there are ways you can navigate this using the institution's supervisory agreements, and actually push it back on the supervisor and the institutions to create that space for you.
That's amazing advice. Thank you. And we've got a question around, do you have any suggestions about data sovereignty?
That's my suggestion. Look, we have some amazing Indigenous-led data sovereignty groups, and you know, we have a really wonderful group here, and they're linked in with our cousins over with you guys over the ditch. I think we need to be staunch about it is any data that is collected remains the, you know, it is that Indigenous groups, persons, it's their data, it's not our data. And so if there are data banks, or if there are other data spaces and places where you feel that that's not the case, where that protection isn't there, then that is also more of an institutional systemic concern that should be taken back to the institutions, because really we should be pushing for all data sort of banks to have an Indigenous protection mechanism within there, and that is led by Indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be able to answer questions today, to have pre-recorded that with Suetonia, considering her amazing new role. And I think we've got one last question that's just popped up, and then I think we'll finish up for the morning, afternoon for you. It is, do you have any suggestions for how to respect Indigenous priorities when Indigenous people are incidentally recruited into a project?
Can you expand on the sort of incidental recruitment?
I can, you can, oh, here we go. When they're not targeted directly by research, but have been incidentally recruited within, I guess, a general population.
Yeah, I think that comes back to the original intent of the research question. And this is where we need to challenge actually that if you have Indigenous peoples involved in your research, then you must be accountable as per Indigenous research best practices. It's a not negotiable. It doesn't matter if your research is not overtly saying that you are going to explore Indigenous peoples in, you know, Christchurch, New Zealand. But if you have recruited Indigenous peoples into your sample, then you need to make sure that their data is protected in the same way that as per our data guidelines and best practice. It's all in our ethics application, actually. and challenge those that need to actually report on that. If it's not investigating, if it's not explicit investigation of any sort of Indigenous sort of health outcome, there should still be a statement if there is an analysis by ethnicity around strength-based approaches, if there's any sort of privileging or disparity that's been found.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tania. This session has been recorded, and so it will be available on the Lowitja Institute YouTube in the coming weeks. So if you know anyone who has missed the session, who you think would benefit from, which I think a lot of people could benefit from this amazing talk, please feel free to share the link. And thank you so much for sharing this morning with us to learn more about strengthening our research using the Consider Statement.
Oh no, thank you. Thank you for asking us to come along and yeah, go forth and multiply. It's awesome. Challenge those systems. Kia ora.